Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I am the host of Reformed GGA, and today we're going to have an initial impressions video of this little beastie right here. This is a Galil Ace Gen 2 in 7.62 by 51, also known as 7.62 NATO, and in this case it's interchangeable with 308 Winchester. Not all 7.62 by 51 guns are, or vice versa, not all 308 Winchester guns are interchangeable with 7.62 by 51, but in this case it is. This little beastie is something that I've had my eye on for a while, and that's because I just like IWI products in general. That's what this is. It comes from Israel Weapon Industries, and they are an interesting manufacturer, to say the least, and most of their designs are fairly unique. They're also known for being very durable, very reliable in terms of, you know, when you get it from the factory, you buy it, it tends to just work. And on top of that, as I've had to find out recently because I had some medical issues a while back, and still technically have medical issues, but I'm on medication now, that greatly helps. But had some medical issues and basically needed money real quick, and some of you guys who watch this channel, you helped out, which was greatly appreciated, but there were still a number of medical expenses that I had to pay for myself, and the way that I did that was by using some money that I had saved back, and also money that I got from selling a large number of guns in my gun collection. And one of the guns that I sold at the time was an IWI gun that I owned at the time, which was an X95 Tavor in 9mm, which is well, just the fact that it was a Tavor was kind of an oddball thing, but a 9mm Tavor was definitely an oddball thing. And I actually made out very well on that particular sale. I bought the gun for around $1,800, which at the time was a little bit high, and even today is still a little bit on the high side, but wound up selling it for $1,830. So I actually made a little bit of money on that one. Now, of course, I couldn't recoup the cost of the ammo spent and things like that, but in terms of the cost of the gun itself, I was definitely able to make that back. And IWI guns have basically been like that for me and for a number of other people. They tend to be actually pretty decent investment guns. You know, I could have taken that money, that $1,800, and thrown it in a savings account, and I would have got like a microscopic amount of, you know, interest from that. Or I could, you know, turn it into a gun and go and shoot it. And of course, I'm not going to get back the money and ammunition, but go and be able to shoot it and have fun with it. And if I happen to need the money, I can sell the gun and basically get back at least as much money as, you know, would have had in the savings account. And now with inflation, you're actually probably better off putting the money in the gun than in the savings account, because inflation is kind of destroying all of our savings accounts, unfortunately. But that is another story that we're not going to be focusing on in this video, although it is a very relevant issue in general. But as it relates to this gun, I wanted to get back into having an IWI. And as you guys know, I have ongoing medical costs, primarily in terms of prescriptions now, and various supplements and other things that I take. And so, but it's a little bit on the limited side. So to get this thing, I kind of had to do a little bit of saving. I had to sell a gun or two, and then, you know, borrow from Peter to pay Paul kind of thing. And eventually I was able to get enough money to get this thing, and I am super ecstatic about it. Now, these guns are not, and this is true of pretty much all of the IWI guns, these are guns that are not the most practical in the world. If you want a practical gun, you're probably going to be looking at some kind of an AR variant, or maybe one of the SIG versions kind of that are based on the AR guns. Those are going to be a whole lot more practical in most scenarios for American shooters. Okay, the reason why you get into guns like this, the IWI guns and some of those higher end type things, isn't always so much for pragmatics. A lot of times it is just simply a collector's piece. It's fun, it's entertaining, it's something, you know, that just puts a smile on your face because you can have it. It's like people that go out and instead of getting, you know, the the boring Honda Civic, they wind up with, you know, Mitsubishi Eclipse or something like that. That was kind of the thing. And back in my day as a teenager, you know, I really wanted to get an Eclipse, and you know, there was a lot of my friends who wound up with the Honda Civics because they were much more practical, and then they would try to trick them out and make them look and do what the Eclipse did. But yeah, there's sometimes where, you know, people go out and they get cars or whatnot, not so much for practicality, but more so for the fun side of things, and that's kind of what this purchase is for me. So I'm not going to be defending this thing as the best 7.62 x 51 gun that has ever lived or anything like that, but I will say that having this thing in my hands, it is just an altogether interesting little beast, and I am very much so struck by the quality of all of the parts and components. As you guys know, I like AKs, and this thing is, you know, basically an AK on steroids. Very, very, very cool designs all the way around. One of the more prominent features that a lot of people know of with the Galils, the modern Galil Aces, I should say. Galil's been around for a long time, but the Aces are relatively new, and that is this little shutter system on the side. They move the charging handle to the other side for right-handed users, and by the way, this is very much so a right-handed gun. Some people are under the mistaken impression that it's ambidextrous. That is not true. It does have ambi magazine releases, but that is literally, well, that and the trigger are literally the only things that are ambi about this gun. The safety is not ambi, the charging handle is definitely not ambi, nothing else is ambi about the gun except for the mag releases and the trigger. But going back to this little shutter system, they move the charging handle to the opposite side, which would normally leave a giant gap in the receiver so that the charging handle can reciprocate, because that's how AKs do what they do. But they came up with a system on this one that would keep it relatively close and still allow the charging handle to cycle. And that is this little shutter system that actually will move with the charging handle out of the way and then spring back up into place. So you can kind of see how it rocks and slides with the charging handle. Very interesting way of going about that problem. Of course, it's not the only gun to do that. Historically, there was the FNC that had a very similar shutter system that worked like that. And in the modern, there is the AKV 521 that also has a similar shutter system. So it's not unique technology, at least not completely, but it is still fairly rare. Most guns don't have a system like that, and people would argue most guns don't need a system like that. Okay, fair enough. But a nice thing about it is that you don't wind up losing any reliability in moving the charging handle to a side that makes more sense for modern shooting styles. For right-handers, it makes a lot more sense to have this charging handle on the left like it is. So that is a very nice improvement, ergonomically speaking. And this is, and moving on from there, something that I wouldn't consider to be necessarily a great improvement. Some people would, but just something that is different is the safety system. Now, on most AKs, you have a very large lever on the side, and that is kind of what this is the remnant of. They don't have the huge side safety lever anymore. Instead, it is a very small lever. Now, it works pretty much the same as a lot of the modern AK safety levers that have the little extended tab. You can use your index finger to move it. But they've greatly reduced the size of it because the charging handle got moved to the other side, and the safety used to be basically used to cover up that slot in the receiver, but that's all been moved to the other side now, so you don't need that giant lever, and so now it's a very small, very neat, very trim little lever. And interestingly, they basically made the gun so that it would be compatible for both people in the West and the East. Most of the people in the West are used to thumb-activated safeties, whereas in the East it's been that primarily that lever on the side of some kind of AK variant that people are have gotten used to. So they still have a side lever for people used to the Eastern system, but for Western types you have a thumb safety on the other side. I would not say that this is the most comfortable thumb safety in the world. Okay, and like I said, this gun for me is more of a collectible. a shootable collectible, but a collectible nonetheless. And so I'm not saying it's the most ergonomic gun in the world, you know, the most practical ever. Like I said, that's usually going to be some kind of AR variant or some of the SIG modification, something like that. I'm not arguing that it's like that. But they do have a safety on the side here that will accommodate people who are used to thumb safety. So back is safe, forward is fire. You know, basically what you would expect. Like I said, it's not the most comfortable safety in the world, but it works like you would expect a thumb safety to work. So that is cool. Already mentioned the magazine releases that are ambidextrous. Like I said, aside from the trigger, that's pretty much the only thing that is ambidextrous. Since this is in 7.62 by 51, IWI has decided, this wasn't the case originally, but they've decided to use 7.62 by 51 magazines that are fairly common in America, which would be these Magpul SRLR type magazines that are relatively plentiful. You can find them in a good number of gun stores and a good number of places online. One interesting feature that I noticed, and I don't know if it'll be true while shooting, but just kind of dinking around here, and of course that's empty magazine, empty gun, but one of the things I noticed about these magazines is that these magazines will actually lock the bolt open. Now this, being an AK derivative, does not have any natural provision for holding open the bolts. I will say that there is an exception in the Galil lineup from IWI. They do make an exception for their 5.56 Galils, and that those ones they actually did give a true bolt hold open device with an actual bolt hold open device inside the receiver. But on the other Galil versions they didn't. But this one, you can get the bolt to hold open with these magazines, but the problem is that as soon as you take out the magazine, the bolt comes forward again. And like I said, I don't know if that will hold true while shooting, because this is when I'm running the action. Of course, I'm not going to run the action nearly as fast as the projectile, not the projectile, but the cartridge as a whole is going to run the action of the gun. So I don't know if that'll hold up, but it is an interesting feature. You know, using specially modified followers for AKs to get a kind of sort of last round hold open kind of thing going on isn't anything new. There's already AK magazines and AK followers that for the 7.62 by 39 versions that do that. This just happens to be kind of a natural quirk of these particular magazines with this particular gun. Be interesting to see if that last round hold open thing remains true even while firing it. Alright, taking that out. Another thing that is just kind of interesting about it is the trigger pull. Let me go ahead and make sure I'm here again. The trigger pull is actually very reminiscent of an AR. Now, I'm an AK guy, and so the typical AK trigger doesn't really bother me. But I know a lot of people that will be happy to hear that this trigger is not like a typical AK trigger. Instead, it's much more like an AR. So, going through here, there is a little bit of take-up before you get much resistance at all. You're basically just working against the return trigger spring. And this gun, unlike a typical AK, actually has a separate return trigger spring. A lot of AKs, they don't. Instead, it's actually the trigger spring, not the trigger spring, but the hammer spring that also acts as a return trigger spring. In this case, that is not the case. There is a separate spring for the hammer, and there's a separate spring for the trigger. So you overcome the return trigger spring, which isn't super heavy, and then you get into the stacking. About 3 millimeters of stacking, and then a very crisp let off. All in all, it's pretty close to a standard AR trigger. This one on my trigger gauge comes in just a little under 6 pounds right now. Now with a little bit of time, that will probably wear in just a little bit, so it'll probably wind up being closer to like 5.5, 5 3/4. But right now it's just a little under a 6 pound pull. So very typical of an AR. You have a little bit of take up, a little bit of stacking, and a fairly crisp let off. So That is interesting that they were able to achieve that, even though it is basically an AK style of gun. Alright. And then another interesting feature that I personally honestly don't like all that much is the pistol grip handle. It's actually pretty comfortable in most regards, except for this little flare at the bottom. The backside of it has just a little bit of a point to it that actually kind of hits the bottom of my palm a little wrong, and that's a little uncomfortable, a little annoying. But other than that little flare, it's actually a very comfortable pistol grip, and it's a good thing too, because this thing is integrated right into the polymer lower, so you're not exactly going to be changing that out anytime soon. So it's a good thing that it's relatively comfortable. If this wasn't a gun that I wanted to keep in a resellable kind of configuration, I'd be very tempted to take a Dremel to that little corner and get that off of there. But it's not super bad, and it's definitely not going to prevent me from enjoying the gun and shooting it, certainly not. So interesting features there. Another thing that I found that was kind of interesting about this gun is this handguard. This handguard is not something that was indicative of the Galil to begin with. Early Galils kind of had a wood handguard that was not altogether dissimilar from what you found on a lot of AKs. And then when the Galil was modernized with the Ace versions, they went with a handguard system that was actually kind of similar to the handguard that you saw on the M4. That is, it had a bunch of kind of had a quad rail thing going on, and they had covers on it to kind of round it out. And on the American commercial market, people complained about those handrails, saying that they were a little bit too wide and also that they weren't long enough. And so this handguard is the result of those complaints. It is a little bit more narrow in profile instead of kind of circular like the other ones were. And they also lengthened it to get past the gas block, and so that really trims up the front end of the gun and makes it look nice and sleek and all that kind of thing. But you can still have all the attachments on it that you could possibly want. These slots on the sides, these two rows of slots going down the side, are M-LOK slots, and it has that of course on the other side as well. And it has a single row of M-LOK slots on the bottom, so you can put, you know, a vertical foregrip, an angled foregrip, lights, lasers, IR designators, whatever you happen to want, you can put them all on there, and you know, it'll work for any of those kinds of things. Now there is a cost to it in terms, well, there is a monetary cost as well, but there is also a practical cost in that this particular handguard is a very heavy handguard. This thing is actually very thick compared to a lot of other handguards that are on the market for, like, say, ARs and those kinds of things. This one is very thick and very beefy. I mean, yes, there's a bunch of holes cut in it, and that does lighten it up some, but at the end of the day, this is still a very rugged handguard, and it is very thick. I'll try to give you guys at least some idea of the thickness of that handguard, and you can see there are some portions of that handguard that are very, very thick, and so there is definitely a lot of weight out at the front end of the gun. Personally, and this is just me being picky, I mean, if you're going to go for a collector's gun that's just for the fun of getting it, you know, it is what it is, and there's not much point in complaining about it because you bought it. But personally, if I had been the one designing the gun, I would have gone, you know, maybe half length or 3/4 of the length in terms of the handguard to save a little bit of weight there. And where I would have put material, if you're going to deal with a gun that is this weight, and by the way, as configured here with this optic, the stock, all this stuff, with a 25 fully loaded magazine in it, this gun weighs in at just a little over 11 pounds. It's like 11 1/8 pounds. And for a 7.62 by 51 gun, that's actually not bad for something that's fully kitted out. Most combat rifles today usually come in at somewhere between 8 and 11 pounds, and so this one's just a little bit outside of that envelope. So that's actually not bad at all. And of course, if you wanted to lighten it up some, you could of course use a smaller optic than what I'm using here, because this optic right here is kind of a pig. That's about a pound just in the optic alone. You could definitely lighten it up a little bit if you wanted to, but like I said, what concerns me more isn't so much the overall weight as to where that weight is being spent. I would have preferred a little bit shorter handguard and for them to lengthen the barrel instead. If I'm going to have a gun that weighs this much and is going to be this front heavy, I would personally rather have more barrel. And that's just because 7.62 by 51 is a fairly potent round, and frankly, when you shorten the barrel down to this, and this is basically a 16-inch barrel, 16 point something to meet the legal definition of a rifle in America, when you shorten the rifle barrel down, basically anything under 20 inches for 7.62 by 51, you're going to be giving up some efficiency of the cartridge, and that there's going to be a lot more unburnt powder, and it's going to be rather noisy, and it's not going to be as powerful downrange. Now, it's still a fairly large cartridge. Let's talk about that real quick here. Standard AK that I usually shoot 7.62 by 51. So these bullets here, this new AK, the Galil, and whether or not it's truly an AK is a little bit debatable because it has been heavily modified. So we'll say modified AK or AK derivative shoots that thing, which is considerably larger. So yes, even if you put it in a shorter barrel, it's still going to be much more powerful than what you had before, probably by at least a good 500 foot-pounds of muzzle energy at least. So yes, it's still going to be considerably more powerful, but if you had a little bit longer barrel, it would be that much more powerful. Instead of, you know, only 500 foot-pounds of muzzle energy more, it might be more like, you know, 750 to even 1,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy more, depending on just how much more barrel length you add. That being said, even though I kind of don't like the distribution of the weights, I would have preferred less handguard and more barrel. But I understand what IWI was trying to achieve in the commercial market. In the commercial market, having space for all of our wonderful accessories, because that's what Americans do with our guns, we like to accessorize them. I get why they chose to go this way instead. And to somewhat alleviate my concerns, they put a brake on the end of this barrel that is rather substantial. That thing is probably going to be incredibly loud, but the advantage of a brake like that, that two-chamber muzzle brake, is that this thing is going to mitigate a lot of the recoil. Like I said, that cartridge is considerably larger, and of course there's going to be more felt recoil that goes along with that. And so having a gun that's a little bit on the heavy side and having a fairly large brake on the end of that is not actually a bad thing when you think about it. If you're going to get a battle rifle in 308s or a battle rifle in 7.62 by 51, having something that's a little bit heavier and something with a really good brake on it is going to be an advantage. And that's basically what they did with the SCAR. The SCAR in its naked configuration is actually not that much lighter than this thing. A naked SCAR with a 16-inch barrel comes in at right about 8 pounds. This thing, if you take off the scope and you don't have it loaded, it comes in at like 8 pounds 6 ounces. So it's not a whole lot heavier than the SCAR. And the SCAR is actually relatively pleasant to shoot. It's still big, and so there's going to be a little bit of a punch there. But it's relatively pleasant to shoot because it has a pretty effective brake on the end. And IWI looked at that and basically said, yeah, we kind of want to get in on that too, so you have the brake. But like I said, there is the disadvantage of the barrel being a little bit shorter than you want it to be. Like I said, ideally it'd be at least 20 inches, if not more. But they wanted to keep basically the overall size of a typical AK, and this thing actually is basically the same size as my other AKs. It's a little bit longer, but we're talking like a half an inch longer than my other AKs, and that depends on which one you're looking at. If you're looking at my GF3 with a short muzzle device on it, this one's like only a half inch longer. If you're looking at my 103 that has the bigger, beefier muzzle device on it, they're basically the same. So they wanted to keep the size down to something that was a little bit more reasonable and more typical for AK owners. So I get what they were trying to do and all that kind of stuff. I would have preferred the longer barrel, but you know, beggars can't be choosers and all that kind of stuff. There is a disadvantage. You're not going to get as high muzzle velocity. You're not going to get as inefficient of a powder burn, etc., etc. And because it has a brake on it, there's going to be a lot of concussive blast that comes out on either side of the gun. So the people who are shooting to the right and left of you are not going to be overly happy with you. But it is still going to be really fun for you. And that is kind of the whole point. So the front end is kind of an interesting set of compromises that were made between the demands of the commercial market and also having something that would be effective in terms of reducing recoil and those kinds of things. And given the demands at the time, I understand perfectly why IWI did what they did there. On the back end is where things get a little bit interesting, and I personally think that IWI did fail here. The front end, not what I would have done, but it is logical and reasonable for IWI to have done what they did there. The back end confuses me though. It's not ineffective, but it is weird. You can see on this version that it's basically a flat top. There are no open sights, and that's very common on the American commercial market right now. We don't put sights on a lot of our ARs or a lot of the other guns that we have shipping out these days, because we know that people are going to put some kind of an optic on there, whether it be a prism sight like in this case, or a red dots, or a holographic sight, or whatever the case happens to be, LPVO, HPVO, whatever the case happens to be. People are usually going to run optics rather than open sights these days. That's very common, and so a lot of manufacturers don't even bother putting the iron sights on anymore because they know that they're not going to get used. I'm perfectly fine with that modification as well, except that it wound up creating a little bit of a problem when it came to what they did with the back end here. In removing the open sights, they wound up putting in this little filler block on the back that would have been where the rear sight was, and this filler block doesn't have the slots in it like the rest of the 1913 rail does. Instead, this block is completely solid, and so I can't mount anything back there. And so this optic that I have here, I had to push a little bit further forward than I really wanted to. And that wouldn't necessarily be a problem, except that the stock wound up getting pushed back a little bit, and because of that, it was really difficult to actually find a way to mount this optic that gave me the correct eye relief. And that is because, in going with the theme of the American commercial market and modifying the gun for that, they decided that they would give the American commercial market a stock system that they were used to. This is basically an M4 stock. This is not the stock that was actually originally designed for the Galil Ace. This is an AR stock that's been cobbled onto the Galil by means of this little black adapter right here. So underneath the stock, you have an AR2 with AR slots and all that kind of thing. And in order to get that on there, they had to use this adapter. And this adapter, as you can see, is fairly wide, and it pushes the stock a little bit further back than it normally would have been. Normally, right after the hinge would have been the stock device that the Galil originally had. It would have come all the way up here. You would have been able to push the stock all a good, what is that, an inch, maybe an inch and an eighth or something like that, further forward. And so the eye relief issue wouldn't have been as big of an issue there. So the back end, as far as the commercial market in general, does confuse me. It's not like I couldn't get it to work. I eventually did. I found a mount that was actually for my 2x prism scope that I'm using with my 3x prism scope, and we'll see how that holds. There's a chance that because it wasn't designed for this particular optic, it might not be quite strong enough and it might shake loose. We'll see when I fire it. But for now, I found a way basically to cantilever this thing out far enough back to get the eye relief to work out with this system. It is also worth noting that I did change the butt pad on this stock for something that had just a little bit more give to it. It doesn't have a ton of give, but a little bit more give to it, just because I was a little bit concerned about the recoil, and there's other people that shoot with me sometimes, and they're not always as appreciative of recoil as I am, so a little bit more pad in the back was a good idea that way. But this whole AR stock thing doesn't make sense to me. I think that really was a mistake. In addition to putting in that block on the back where the rear sight used to be without putting in the slots for the 1913 rail, I think that was a mistake too. But the stock really does confuse me. First, you have that adapter that I mentioned that pushes things back and makes it harder to get proper eye relief. And then on top of that, the stock that they chose, which in and of itself is a high quality stock, this is a Magpul CTR stock. It has a pretty good reputation, except that they didn't really think about its use very properly. They did include the cheek riser for it, and on an AK type gun, that's a good thing to have the cheek riser to get you up with the sights. But this cheek riser isn't as high as the original Galil cheek riser was. The original Galil cheek riser would basically put you right on the level of the 1913 rail, and what that would allow you to do is to use full height optics. You would have a cheek riser that would be high enough to use full height optics, full height AR optics, like 1/3 lower co-witness and whatnot. But because this cheek riser doesn't quite get to that same level, you can't use full height optics. You have to use low mount optics, at least if you want to have a real nice cheek weld. Do you absolutely need to have a perfect cheek weld in all situations? It's arguable that you don't. But if you want it to be nice and comfy, we'll say, you need to still low mount your optics, which is a little bit annoying. So the cheek riser options are not as good because you're going with the AR system instead of something that was designed for an AK type system, so that creates a little bit of a problem. And then on top of that, the CTR stock has this little clasp in the front that is meant to be a friction lock that's meant to take all the wiggle out of the system. But even though I put in activated that friction lock, you can still hear it wiggling. Why? It's because the tube underneath isn't the right size for this particular stock. This tube is just a little too small, and so even if I engage the friction lock, you'll still get the wiggle. So why would IWI do that? I have absolutely no idea. Okay, maybe they figured that people would want to put on their own tube, you know, to once they got it, and that's probably true of some people. They'll put on their own AR tube that will be the correct size. But then the question comes up, why invest in giving them a high quality CTR stock when they could have just used like an MOE stock or something like that? That would have saved a little bit of money on the initial purchase. That one really does confuse me. Like I said, I like the gun overall, it's great, and I found a system of mounting the optic that would work with this particular stock system. I was able to get a height that was a little bit lower to accommodate a little lower riser, and even though there is now basically a giant spacer in the stock system, I was able to cantilever this back far enough to actually make the eye relief work and all that. I got it to all work out, but if they had fixed the issue with that block, actually extending the 1913 rail all the way to the back instead of putting in just kind of a filler block, and if they'd used an actual Galil dedicated stock, I wouldn't have had a lot of the issues with, you know, getting the proper eye relief and all that thing to begin with. So, a little miffed about that. Overcomeable, but a little miffed about that. But overall, a very high quality gun. Like I said, the handguard on this thing is extremely beefy. I have never seen a handguard that was that beefy before on any of the other guns that I've dealt with. That thing is there to last. And then the action on this thing, with the hammer down, I should say, was very smooth, but it does have a very heavy hammer, so pulling the charging handle back when the hammer is down is a little bit of an issue because it's a very strong hammer spring, but that's not a bad thing. It just means it's a very, very, very robust system. One interesting side note that's not really here nor there, but it is interesting, is that these Galils actually have a firing pin that has a spring in it. That is, it is a spring-loaded firing pin, which is what you would see on a lot of hammer-fired handguns, for example. Usually have spring-loaded firing pins. It's a very common thing in handguns. And even in a lot of PCCs, a lot of guns that are pistol caliber, you know, that might be a little bit larger platform, like say the CZ Scorpion and guns like that, they also will have spring-loaded firing pins. But you don't usually see spring-loaded firing pins on full-size rifles. And the reason for that is that full-size rifles usually have a relatively small firing pin that doesn't have a whole lot of inertia of its own. And in semi-auto guns, it's usually combined with basically military-type primers, which tend to be hard. So, you know, a 7.62 by 39 cartridge, most of the typical ones that people shoot are kind of infamous for having relatively hard primers. The problem, though, is that when you start dealing with certain commercial ammunition, they don't always use hard primers. And especially if you're dealing with, say, .308 Winchester. This thing is technically 7.62 by 51, but it's also compatible with .308 Winchester. And one of the things that makes it compatible with .308 Winchester is the fact that it has that spring-loaded firing pin. .308 Winchester rounds very frequently have actually relatively light primers because they're meant to be used in hunting rifles. With relatively light triggers, relatively light hammer springs, and so they need to be able to be set off by a very light system. Well, this thing, as a semi-auto in the commercial version, still has a lot of its military-esque traits in it, including a very heavy hammer spring and those kinds of things. And the firing pin is set to military-grade primers. So the whole combination of things tends to be very beefy, and with the .308 commercial loads, you could set them off hypothetically just from the inertia of the bolt closing on the round, in which case you get a slam fire type scenario, or perhaps in certain cases you could even get to the points of having an out of battery detonation. And that's one of the things that people who manufacture 7.62 by 51 .308 rifles have to contend with, is the commercial ammunition that, like I said, a lot of times has a lighter primer, much easier to set off. Just simply having a fairly light firing pin doesn't always do the trick of keeping away from slam fires. So what IWI did is they made theirs spring-loaded, just to avoid that issue. And like I said, that's one of the things that makes this gun capable of firing both the military-grade 7.62 by 51 ammunition and the commercial-grade .308. And that's one of the things I like about these more expensive guns. Like I said, they're usually much more durable and those kinds of things, but also it is not universally true, but often true, that if you pay more money on the right kind of gun, you can usually shoot a much wider range of ammunition with it. Another case in point on this that is like this is the CZ Scorpion versus the Stribog. The CZ Scorpion is a little bit more expensive platform, and frankly, it has a little bit wider range of operation compared to the Stribog. In this case, the Galil Ace in 7.62 by 51 is capable of taking .308 ammo, but not all of, say, your AR-10s or your AR-308s are going to be able to do that as well, or going to be able to take the commercial ammo as well. But yeah. So yeah, that is the new little beastie. And like I said, I'm very happy to have this thing. There are a few choices on the back end of the gun that I think IWI needs to rethink. I understand why they did it, but I'm going to say that it really was the wrong solution to the problem. Putting in a block to replace the rear sight that doesn't continue the 1913 rail is definitely a problem. Putting a giant spacer in there that can mess with eye relief issues is not a good idea. And then having a stock with a friction lock on a tube that is too small is just confusing. And then having a stock that is limited on the height of cheek riser that you can put on it is also somewhat befuddling. But all in all, a very high quality weapon, good smooth action, everything locks up nice and tight. Just incredible machining on the internals, and maybe I'll do a video in the future on the assembly and disassembly process of this and walking through some of the internals that I like. But initial impressions are that it is a very high quality gun. You know, you do spend a lot on these kinds of guns, but once you get them in your hand and you start messing with them, you definitely understand why. And if you're a collector who likes these kinds of things, it'll be worth it to you. Like I said, if you're looking for a practical gun, these kinds of guns are not. IWI in general is not the best place to go for a lot of civilians as far as practical guns. A lot of times AR-15s, AR-10s, something in that category, some of the SIG guns, they're kind of modifications of the AR design. That would be a better place for you to go. But for people who are interested in more collectible guns that they can still shoot without significantly depreciating the value, IWI is very nice that way. And like I said, they tend to be very durable. Overbuilt is kind of the definition of all the IWI stuff. And in that regard, very nice guns, very well machined, very reliable. There's lots of issues that they've thought through and they've taken care of. Very much so a very cool setup. All right, that's all that I got for you guys tonight. Thank you very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know him, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.